What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I know the Obi-Wan Kenobi videos we make are not the most popular. I don't care. I love talking about it. But here's the thing. I loved episode 5. Specifically, I love the whole fight between Reva and Darth Vader. That was probably, if I'm being honest, I think that's one of the greatest lightsaber fights or like just duels that I've seen in Star Wars. And I know it goes against conventional wisdom, and I'll explain why here in a minute. But one of the things that I really loved about the whole episode was that it kind of humanized everybody. Right? It sort of brought everybody down. That up to this point, it's largely just been these characters that have been thrown into the show for varying reasons, and we didn't really know anything about their stories. A really good example of this is the character of Tala. Right? Like, we didn't really know her story. I mean, she was just kind of there, and we knew that she worked for the Empire at one point, then defected to what I guess you could call the Rebel Alliance. I don't know if it's really the Rebel Alliance at this point, and it's just kind of been working against the Empire ever since, but we didn't know her story. One of the cool things about this that I loved about her telling that story about how they were basically just there to round up people as far as they were aware, as far as they had been told, because they weren't paying taxes, different things like that. When in reality, they were on a mission to round up Force sensitives and then hand them over to the Inquisitors. I love that because one of the things that it does is it kind of changes the way that you see members of the Empire, right? Like officers, foot soldiers, essentially anybody but like Darth Vader, the Emperor, and probably stormtroopers, right? That the funny thing about this is when you look at them historically from like the movie perspective or even some of the TV shows, they just kind of look like people who were there, right? And it's like, okay, whatever, they're just officers more often than not, unless you're talking about like Admiral Piet or somebody like that who's of particular importance in the movies. They're just people who were there and do things. And you almost kind of dismiss them, right? You almost just kind of like, I mean, whatever. And you assume that for whatever reason, they just hold this wholesale allegiance to the Empire. But I never really looked at it from the perspective of like they were quote unquote just following orders, which is an interesting road to take, right? It's an interesting approach to take. That being said, it also does make perfect sense that Imperial officers and people like that are basically being sent on missions and not being told what those missions actually are. And the reason why I think that's so cool and so important is because it really kind of shows for those officers, they're still just regular individuals with their own moral compass. And for whatever reason, they joined the Empire, right? For whatever reason, they joined that cause. Maybe they believed that they were doing the right thing, but when you tell them, we're sending you on a mission to round up families, including kids, and we're just gonna get rid of them all, a lot of folks will probably say no to that. So being duped, right? Being tricked, and then being told like that's the whole thing. Now, she's only one person, and her story doesn't seem to indicate that anybody else, anybody that was with her, turncoated against the Empire, and it just kind of worked here. The whole story is from her perspective. But I love that whole thing. And I love that whole thing because it kind of brought her back down to a more human level. And by extension, presumably and possibly a lot of the other officers that exist out there that work for the Empire as well. Now, of particular importance in this episode is one of the things that I also liked. Leia, Obi-Wan Kenobi, all of them, they were kind of background characters. The main stars of the show were sort of background characters to a degree. There were 3 other things that I loved about this. The first thing that I loved, really 4 other things that I loved. The first thing that I loved was the whole story about Reva, right? From now on, when it comes to theories, I'm just gonna defect to you guys and be like, what do you guys think's happening? And you guys are gonna be like, here's what I think's happening. It's like, hey guys, so you all came up with great theories and it's most likely true. Because a lot of you guys called it early. A lot of you guys were like, I mean, Reva's most likely just a youngling who survived by whatever manner and whatever means. And that was kind of it. And it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, I love getting lost in theories and I love coming up with like crazy, extravagant theories. To me, the simplest answer usually turns out to be the most boring one. Having said that, I did think it was cool the way they did the whole thing with Reva, that she was basically just a youngling who survived. Now, I loved how they pulled the rug out from under that, because as soon as she was telling her story and she was like, I just played dead, my first thought was, okay, that doesn't make any sense, because surely Anakin Skywalker, at the height of his power, would be able to, if nothing more, use the Force to be able to discern whether or not these guys are dead. Because if all somebody had to do was just play dead in order to survive the purge of Order 66, a lot of people would have done that. And I'm sure a lot of people tried that. There'd be a lot more Jedi walking around than there are right now. So I was like, there's no way that that's true. I loved how they yanked the rug out from under that. And that in effect, Vader knew it the whole time. Anakin Skywalker knew the entire time that Reva was faking. And from the time that she had presumably faked dead, or at least showed up on the scene and said, I want to join the Empire, until that moment at the end of the show, she was just being used. it was all just some kind of a ruse. Now, that kind of begs the question, how was it that she was able to become an Inquisitor and demonstrate Force sensitivity and use a lightsaber at the same time? Likely she passed herself off as somebody who had never had anything to do with the Jedi Council or anything, and she was just a person born out there with Force sensitivity, and like, that was it. Right? In the same way that like the Empire was rounding up, people out there who had Force abilities and most likely turned them to Inquisitors or to Dark Jedi. If they didn't want to turn, they would kill them. That for whatever reason, Reva just demonstrated the ability that the Empire decided to keep her. Right now, we know what was going on behind the scenes is that Vader largely made an exception because he's like, we can use her to basically track down Obi-Wan Kenobi. So I loved that whole thing. The death of the Grand Inquisitor and all that, just a great big huge ruse, right? Great big huge trick. I loved that. I thought it was great because what it showed is that Vader's not just some lumbering beast going on out there, which we'll actually kind of contradict here in a second, but he's not some dim-witted buffoon out there who's just following the orders of the Emperor and that's it, that kind of a thing. It still shows that Vader is incredibly cunning. And it shows that Vader's still incredibly intelligent, right? That I loved that aspect. I love that aspect of him when he was Anakin, and I love that they maintain that aspect of him now that he's Darth Vader. Because it's very easy to find yourself in that position of power that Vader has, and then almost kind of rest on your laurels, right? And almost just kind of find yourself losing your grip, right? Losing that sort of cunning nature because there's nobody there to challenge you. And so as a result of that, there's no reason to kind of keep those skills going. So I love that whole thing. Having said that, let's talk about the fight between Darth Vader and Reva. I loved that fight. Oh my God, I love that fight for a variety of reasons. If I'm being honest with you guys, I think it's one of the best fights that we've seen Darth Vader have. And here's the reason why. I know it didn't have like all the extravagant lightsaber maneuvers and different things along those lines, but that fight was only as good as it was because we learned the story of Reva, that she was fighting with vengeance and anger and different things like that. In the scenes, or really the multiple scenes where you kind of had that little duel that took place, that training session between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin when Anakin was younger, when he was still a Padawan, it was Obi-Wan Kenobi hitting at the idea that Anakin's still reckless, that Anakin still has this quest to prove himself, and until he finds some measure of inner peace, he'll stay a Padawan. What this really seemed to indicate is it seemed to show that Anakin both learned and didn't learn, that Obi-Wan Kenobi was like, Anakin's blinded by vengeance. All he wants is me. Right? I'm the only thing that he wants, and he's blind to everything else, or seemingly blind to everything else. What this demonstrated, combined with the fact that Anakin knew that Reva was a youngling the entire time, it shows that he learned. Like, it shows he learned his lessons with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I loved that. Right? He was playing the long game, that Obi-Wan was always trying to teach him patience. So he's like, what better way to demonstrate patience than literally almost like a decade or so of time passes, and I'm playing this long game. I loved that. Right, I love that whole thing. But the fight between Reva and Vader, right? This whole thing was cool because what it showed is that in a lot of ways, Reva was now playing the role of Anakin when Anakin was the Padawan, and Anakin as Vader is playing the role of Obi-Wan when Obi-Wan was Anakin's master. That Vader here demonstrated patience. He demonstrated a lack of recklessness. I also thought it was pretty damn baller that he defeated this girl without ever having once popped his lightsaber. I love that, right? Just using the Force. Now, here's what I thought was really, really cool, right? This is what I thought was really, really cool. There was no extravagant lightsaber maneuverability with Darth Vader. Even when he did take Reva's lightsaber and take one half of it and then give her the other half, that she showed finesse, right? I mean, a little bit of recklessness, and she's not polished, right? Her movements aren't that fluid, and she'd have a little bit of way to go in order to like master lightsaber dueling, right? But she was far more fluid than Vader was. And I love that contrast, right? That when Vader was simply just using the Force, this girl never had a chance. And it was obvious. It was like, okay, this girl, no. I mean, Vader's literally like, I don't even have to pop my lightsaber to beat you, girl. Like, he's just using the Force and moving her out of the way and dodging her, blocking her lightsaber shots. Let's also talk about that moment when Vader stopped the ship with the Force. That was legit. That's what's up. I absolutely love that. But, I love that duel between the two of them because once he finally got a lightsaber, right? Once he took that half of her lightsaber and used it for himself, he was cumbersome. He was clumsy. Right? It was like, I mean, has this guy ever lifted a lightsaber before? And I loved that because he's got this great big huge bulking suit which slows down his maneuverability, prevents him from being able to be as agile as he was before he had the suit when he was in his human form. I loved that contrast because what it shows is the true power of Vader is in his use of the Force and his cunning nature, that his lightsaber skills, that's long gone, right? He's not the Darth Vader he used to be. I loved that. I absolutely loved that whole thing. And finally, the thing that I really loved the most here, right? What I absolutely loved the most about this whole episode is that they still kept Darth Vader as this kind of menacing, omnipresent force. There is such a thing as overusing Vader. It's entirely possible, right? Like, it's easy to overuse Darth Vader. But what I loved, right, the thing that was so cool about this is that Darth Vader was maintained as this just kind of menacing, dark presence that when he arrives on the scene, it's a big deal. But I also love the idea that while he did learn his lessons from Obi-Wan Kenobi, in a lot of ways, he's still Anakin. In a lot of ways, he's still Anakin Skywalker. That he hasn't become the Darth Vader that we're the most familiar with in episodes 4 and 5 and 6, right? Just the guy who's slower, the guy who's more methodical. He's getting there, but he's not quite there yet. He's still filled with emotion. He's still filled with passion. He's still filled with just this vengeance, this hunger to hunt Obi-Wan Kenobi. I mean, when you look at the scene from episode 4 and you compare it to this, there's far less emotion there with Darth Vader, right? He's not nearly as emotional, not nearly as reckless. He's far more patient, far more methodical than he is here. And I loved that. I love that comparison. So what it shows us, and the thing that's so cool about this, is it shows us the evolution of Darth Vader. He's still a little more Anakin than he is traditional Darth Vader, but he's getting to that point. And this was obviously the best episode of the whole show, right? Which makes the most sense. It was just a phenomenal episode. Absolutely love it. I thought it was amazing. But I'm really curious to see how things wrap up, because as far as I'm aware, we're like one episode out from the ending of the show. I'm really excited to see how the whole thing ends and how this whole thing concludes. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.